the desert wind, a tireless sculptor, had long since smoothed the edges of the abandoned El Corso border checkpoint. Dust devils danced over crumbling concrete barriers, and the sun-baked silence was broken only by the distant hum of high-tension power lines. It was a place of ghosts and forgotten dreams, until a little after midnight, when patrol officers Ben Carter and Maria Rodriguez saw the glint of steel. Their cruiser's headlights cut through the inky blackness, illuminating a black Ford Expedition, its once sleek contours mangled beyond recognition. It was not a wreck in the traditional sense. The damage was internal, violent, the result of something impossibly strong clawing its way out. The passenger side door was ripped half off its hinges, bent outward at an unnatural angle. The metal shrieked silent agony. The roof was warped, pushed up from within. A giant, invisible fist had slammed into it from below. "Hold up, Ben," Maria said, her voice tight, echoing in the confined space of the patrol vehicle. Her hand went to her sidearm, a practiced, involuntary motion. What in blazes did that? Ben cut the engine, plunging them into deeper silence. Only the soft tick of cooling metal from their own cruiser broke the quiet. He swung his door open, the sound a loud intrusion. The air, usually crisp and dry, felt thick with something metallic, something acrid. Blood. He saw it everywhere. Not just spatters, but great sweeping streaks across the Expedition's dark paint, some smears so thick they had congealed into grotesque shiny patches. Inside, the seats were soaked, shredded. It was a charnel house without a single body. Just gore. "Stay alert, Maria," Ben muttered, his hand on his own holstered handgun. He moved with cautious, deliberate steps, his eyes sweeping the desolate landscape. The moon, a sliver in the vast desert sky, cast long, distorted shadows, making every creosote bush writhe. Maria followed, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "No casings," she observed, her voice barely a whisper. "No bullet holes. No glass shattered from an impact. This is not a collision, and it sure as hell is not a shootout." Ben knelt, examining the ground. Deep gouges like a massive claw had raked the dry earth, led away from the vehicle. They were too precise, too uniform for a wild animal, yet too irregular for human tools. The sheer volume of blood indicated multiple victims. The sheer, terrifying vacuum of bodies made the hairs on his arms stand up. This was a scene of utter savagery, yet utterly devoid of the expected aftermath. "Check the border cameras," Ben instructed, his voice low. "The old ones." Something picked it up. Maria nodded, already moving towards the decrepit checkpoint booth, a relic from a time before more advanced surveillance had rendered it obsolete. Its rusted metal and faded paint were barely visible in the moonlight. She knew the power conduits were still active, a quirk of forgotten bureaucracy. While she worked, Ben continued his grim inspection. He found a piece of torn fabric, dark and heavy, caught on a jagged piece of metal. It was part of a military-grade uniform. Below it, embedded in the hardened mud, was a distinct, three-pronged imprint, unlike anything he had ever seen. Not a boot, not an animal track, but something unnervingly organic and powerful. It was the shape of something monstrous. Maria's voice, sharp with alarm, ripped through the night. "Ben, you need to see this. Right now." He sprinted to the booth. Maria was hunched over a flickering monitor, the image grainy, distorted, but unmistakably showing the Ford Expedition. The timestamp read 7. Then a blur, a fleeting, almost subliminal image. It was a shadow, enormous and impossibly fast. It moved on two legs, but its limbs stretched and contorted unnaturally long and powerful, Ben caught a glimpse of something too large, too agile, too wrong to be human. It was gone in an instant, a flicker across the screen, a phantom that absorbed the light around it, leaving a void. Then the screen went blank, the image cutting out with a crackle of static. Maria stumbled back, her hand clamped over her mouth. Her eyes, wide with disbelief and terror, reflected the ghost of the image. What was that, Ben? Ben stood frozen. The phantom image burned into his mind's eye. The sheer speed, the unnatural gait, the impossible proportions. This was not some drug runner's hit. This was something else entirely. Something born of nightmares. Less than an hour later, the desert silence was shattered by the whine of engines and the sudden glare of high-intensity lights. A convoy of black sport utility vehicles, unmarked but radiating authority, descended upon El Corso like vultures. Agents, clad in dark tactical gear, swarmed the site, moving with a chilling efficiency. They were not local law enforcement. This was the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but with a speed and ruthlessness Ben had never witnessed. Perimeter secure. No one in? No one out? A voice boomed, amplified by a bullhorn. An agent, tall and imposing, with eyes like chips of flint, approached Ben and Maria. Officers, your cooperation is appreciated. This scene is now under federal jurisdiction. All evidence, all testimony, will be handled by us. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Before Ben could speak, Maria was already being ushered away by two other agents, their movements precise, robotic. Ben tried to protest, but the flint-eyed agent merely held up a hand. "Officer Carter," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register. "What you saw here tonight, what you did not see, it never happened. You will file a routine patrol report stating you found an abandoned vehicle with signs of animal activity. Nothing more. Any deviation, any word to anyone, and your career, your life, everything you care about will be significantly impacted. Do you understand?" Ben looked into those cold, unblinking eyes. He understood. The threat was explicit, unwavering. He swallowed hard, the metallic taste of fear coating his tongue. He nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his head. They seized everything. The expedition was loaded onto a flatbed, tarped over. The ground was meticulously scoured, every trace of blood, every unique imprint, systematically removed. The nightmare had unfolded, but by dawn the desert looked as it always had, empty, silent, undisturbed. Maria was reassigned the next morning, transferred to a distant sector without explanation. Ben made a few cautious calls, trying to piece together information. He reached out to contacts in state police, even a distant cousin in the Drug Enforcement Administration. Each call was met with a polite but firm denial. Nobody knew anything about El Corso. The silence was absolute, a carefully constructed wall. The image of the shadow, impossibly fast and monstrously limbed, haunted Ben's waking hours and invaded his sleep. He saw it in the flickering shadows of his living room, heard its phantom movement in the creak of his floorboards. He was a man consumed by an unseen horror, compelled to understand what he had witnessed. That same night, Officer Ben Carter vanished. His home was empty, his truck still in the driveway. No one came looking. His patrol colleagues received an official memo. Officer Carter has submitted an immediate resignation for personal reasons. But deep down, they knew something was profoundly wrong, and it had everything to do with El Corso. Luis Ramirez moved through the dusty streets of Nogales like a shadow, familiar with every alleyway, every hidden passage, every shift in the wind that carried the scent of mesquite and diesel. He was a border intelligence agent, formerly an army ranger, and his knowledge of the Sonoran Desert was as innate as his flawless Spanish. This made him indispensable to the Border Patrol's intelligence division, but also, at times, an inconvenient asset. He saw things others did not, connected dots too often left disparate. His mind worked like a precision instrument, dissecting threats, identifying patterns. His contact, a burly Drug Enforcement Administration agent named Miguel, slipped a manila envelope across the worn table of a backroom diner. Miguel's face was etched with a grim weariness that went beyond the usual fatigue of narcotics enforcement. His eyes darted nervously, reflecting a deep-seated apprehension. "Luis?" Miguel murmured, his voice low. "You did not get these from me. Understand?" Luis nodded, his fingers already unsealing the envelope. Inside were a series of digital photographs, blurry and pixelated, but chillingly clear in their implications. They depicted the scene at El Corso, the mangled expedition, the ground torn up. Luis's gaze sharpened. The rips in the metal were unlike any he had ever seen. They were not blunt force trauma, nor the clean punctures of a bullet. They were jagged. Something immense had exerted pressure from within, then shredded its way out. The patterns of damage were unnervingly precise. The perpetrator knew exactly where to apply force for maximum effect. These scratches, Luis noted, zooming in on one of the images on his secure tablet. He ran a thumb across the screen, tracing the deep furrows in the earth near the vehicle. "They're not animal tracks. Not a bear, not a mountain lion. Too elongated, too structured. And the depth? It displayed incredible focused strength." He paused, a knot tightening in his gut. The metal is not just bent. It's torn from the inside out. Miguel leaned closer, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. "Luis, it's not a wolf. It's something else entirely. Something the federal authorities want buried deep." He glanced around the empty diner, even though they were in a private room. "Don't go where you're not asked, mi amigo. This is not a case. It's a hole, and they'll bury anyone who looks too closely." The fear in Miguel's eyes was palpable, and it was not the usual fear of cartel retribution. This was a deeper, more primal dread. This was a man genuinely afraid for his life and for Luis's. The warning, saturated with raw terror, did not deter Luis. It hardened his resolve. Barely a day after the El Corso incident, a directive had swept through every border agency, every local law enforcement office like a cold front. It was a Federal Bureau of Investigation communique, marked eyes only, do not distribute, demanding absolute silence regarding the El Corso incident. No comments, no internal inquiries, no leaks. The language was unusually aggressive, threatening severe repercussions for any breach. For Luis, it was not a warning. It was confirmation. They were hiding something of monumental significance. Something that had terrified a veteran Drug Enforcement Administration agent into speaking in whispers. Something that had made a seasoned Border Patrol officer like Ben Carter vanish without a trace. His sudden resignation an obvious fabrication. Luis had a network, a small web of contacts cultivated over years, and the story of Carter's disappearance had filtered back to him, distorted by rumor and official obfuscation. He had not believed it for a second. He looked again at the photos. The precise, almost surgical tearing of the metal. The sheer volume of blood, yet no bodies. The unnatural silence from every official channel. It coalesced into a chilling picture. This was not a random act of violence. This was something engineered, something controlled, something that had been systematically covered up. Luis closed his tablet. The images still burned into his mind. He pushed the manila envelope back to Miguel. "Thank you, mi amigo. You've done enough." Miguel nodded, relief washing over his face. He grabbed the envelope, already visibly more at ease. As Luis walked out of the diner, the desert sun beat down on his face, but he felt a cold shadow creeping over him. His professional duty was clear. His intuition screamed. He could not let this go. Official orders be damned. He knew the terrain, he knew the people, and he had a grim feeling that the truth of El Corso was not confined to a single incident. It was bleeding across the border, and he was the only one willing to follow the trail of blood, no matter where it led. The truth, Luis knew, was a currency often traded in whispers across borders, in the hushed tones of those who had seen too much. He used his connections, threads spun over years of discreet favors and shared dangers, to slip across the international line under the cloak of night. His destination lay deep in the remote, sun-baked hills of Sonora, Mexico, where the official arm of the law rarely reached, and where tales of the uncanny circulated with the speed of wildfire. He found Mateo in a village so small it barely registered on any map. A cluster of adobe huts clinging to the side of a dusty arroyo. The old farmer, his face a road map of sun-baked wrinkles, was still shaken. His small flock of goats, his livelihood, had been decimated 2 nights prior. "They were strong, senor," Mateo recounted, his voice raspy with grief and fear, sitting on a worn stool outside his hut. He gestured towards the makeshift corral, where patches of dark, dried blood stained the earth. Not like a coyote, not a mountain lion. This was different. Luis knelt, examining the ground. The goats had been brutally killed, their bodies ripped apart with incredible force. Yet, as Mateo had said, the meat remained largely untouched. There were no gnaw marks, no signs of a desperate scavenger. Only the blood was the target. It had been drained or splattered with a terrifying, almost artistic violence. The ground was littered with torn bits of fur, but the carcasses themselves, though mangled, were strangely clean. "The throats, senor," Mateo whispered, his eyes wide, torn open, like a beast, but clean. Luis nodded, the farmer's words echoing the observation he had made from Miguel's photographs of the expedition. An unnatural precision to the savagery. He then spoke to Ricardo, a scrawny teenager who tended a flock of sheep on a nearby ridge. Ricardo, his face pale beneath a layer of dust, swore he had seen something impossible. He described the attack, confirming Mateo's account of the sheer, overwhelming force. But then, Ricardo hesitated, glancing around, fearing the very air might listen. "And you heard something else, Ricardo?" Luis pressed gently, sensing the boy's terror. The teenager nodded, trembling. "I hid, senor, under the rocks. One of them, it came close. It spoke." Ricardo squeezed his eyes shut, trying to banish the memory. "Not just a growl, senor. It spoke, in Spanish, like a person." Luis felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He pictured the shadow from the El Corso surveillance footage, the unnatural limbs, the impossible speed. "What did it say?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Ricardo opened his eyes, now filled with tears. It said, "Keep the blood clean." And then it laughed, a dry, rasping sound like stones grating together. Luis's mind reeled, a creature with bestial strength ripping through flesh, but with the intelligence to speak, to give instructions, to laugh. This was not some mutated animal. He moved to the edge of the corral, where the ground hardened into sun-baked rock. Here the tracks were clearer. Deep, distinct scratches like chisel marks raked across the stone. Each mark was clearly from a 5-clawed appendage, each claw nearly a finger's length. They were not paws, they were digits, powerful and articulated, capable of inflicting precise, concentrated strikes. This was not a wild animal's foot. This was a hand, a monstrous, powerful hand. The pieces snapped into place with horrifying clarity. The mutilated expedition, the blood, the missing bodies, the impossible speed caught on camera. The precision of the damage, the focus on blood, the untouched meat. And now the talking, laughing predators with human-like clawed hands. This was not some strange new species of wildlife. This was not a curse or a legend come to life. This was a project, a deliberate, controlled experiment that warped human physiology, transforming men and women into something utterly monstrous, yet retaining their core intellect and, terrifyingly, their capacity for communication. They were not mindless beasts. They were instruments controlled and directed by someone for some sinister purpose. Luis imagined the creatures in the desert, moving with unnatural grace, ripping through their prey, then speaking, their voices carrying through the night. The implication was stark and chilling. These were not merely predators. They were weapons. Living, breathing, intelligent weapons, unleashed and operating by design. He thanked Mateo and Ricardo, leaving them with what little cash he carried, knowing it would not alleviate their terror, but it would buy a moment of peace. As he turned back towards the border, the vast, silent desert pressed in on him, no longer a familiar friend, but a canvas for unseen horrors. The line between man and beast, once so clearly defined, had been erased, brutally redrawn by a hidden hand. Luis knew with grim certainty that he had stumbled upon something far more dangerous than any cartel. He had found a shadow beneath the border, and it was intelligent, powerful, and utterly devoid of humanity. The silence from Lily Anderson was the first clue. Luis's partner, Agent Lily Anderson, was rarely quiet. Her energy was a whirlwind of bright observations, her laughter a frequent punctuation to the grinding monotony of border work. But for the past day, her phone had gone straight to voicemail. Colleagues offered shrugs and unconvincing suppositions. Family emergency, one suggested. Sick leave, another offered. None of it felt right. A cold premonition, like a desert chill before dawn, settled over Luis. Then, just as abruptly as she had vanished, Lily returned. She walked into the small, cluttered intelligence office, her gait precise, her uniform crisp. Physically, she was unchanged. Same auburn hair, pulled back in her usual severe bun. Same sharp features, same slender frame. But the Lily Luis knew, the Lily who bubbled with stories of her 5-year-old daughter, who fretted over overdue reports and celebrated every minor bust with disproportionate glee, was gone. Her eyes. They were the first thing Luis noticed, usually warm, expressive, quick to crinkle at the corners when she smiled. Now they were distant, flat, like polished stones. And in the dim light of the office, Luis saw it. A subtle, unsettling luminescence reflected from their depths, like a cat's eyes in the darkness, but with a predatory gleam that sent a shiver down his spine. The warmth was replaced by a chilling vacancy. "Lily," Luis said, his voice hesitant. "Where have you been?" "We were worried." She turned her head, her gaze sweeping over him, taking him in without a flicker of recognition or emotion. "On leave," she stated, her voice devoid of inflection, a flat declaration. Her lips barely moved. She turned back to her desk, her movement stiff, economical. Luis tried to engage her. "Everything all right? Your daughter, how's she doing?" Lily paused, her back to him. A beat of silence stretched. Then she slowly turned, her head tilted slightly, a blank, confused expression on her face. "My daughter?" she echoed, as the concept was foreign to her. "I don't have a daughter." Luis felt a jolt of ice water. He knew Lily's daughter Isabella by name, by sight. He had seen photos, heard Lily speak of her endlessly, her voice softened with maternal love. "Isabella," he prompted, his voice strained. "You talk about her all the time." A flicker crossed Lily's face then, not recognition, but a fleeting spasm of irritation. Her eyes hardened further, the strange luminescence intensifying for a split second. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice edged with a subtle, uncharacteristic harshness. She turned back to her desk, dismissing him. Over the next few days, Luis watched her, a hawk preying on a viper. Her new habits were profoundly unsettling. She became a creature of silence, moving through the office like a phantom, avoiding eye contact, never engaging in casual conversation. Her meals became solitary affairs, taken in the break room at odd hours. One evening, working late, Luis heard a strange, tearing sound from the break room. He approached cautiously, peering through the doorway. Lily was at the counter, hunched over something red and glistening. She was tearing into a slab of raw beef, her fingers sunk deep into the bloody meat. She brought a chunk to her mouth, chewing slowly, deliberately, her eyes fixed on some distant point. "Lily?" Luis asked, his voice low, controlled. "What are you doing?" She paused, her jaw still moving. She slowly turned her head, a smear of blood on her cheek. Her eyes met his, utterly devoid of emotion, indifferent. She looked at him as an object, not a colleague, not a human being. She did not even understand the question, let alone the impropriety of her actions. There was no shame, no embarrassment, just a chilling void. Luis felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. The memory of the goat farmer, Mateo, flashed through his mind. The meat was untouched, senor. Only the blood. He backed away slowly, his heart thudding against his ribs. This was not Lily Anderson. Not the woman he had known, respected, and shared a camaraderie with for years. Her body was hers. Her face was hers. But the essence, the core of her being had been stripped away and replaced. The predatory glow in her eyes, the inhuman strength she possessed to tear raw meat with her bare hands, the chilling amnesia about her own child. It all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. She was one of them, a living, breathing embodiment of the shadows he had seen at El Corso. The project was not just creating monsters. It was twisting humans into them, erasing their pasts, their identities, transforming them into something utterly alien, yet disturbingly familiar. Lily was a casualty, a victim, and now a hunter in the making. The realization settled over Luis like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. He had to find the source, before more people vanished, before more people returned, changed, soulless. Luis knew that the threat had escalated beyond anything he could tackle alone. The creatures were intelligent, tactical, and capable of erasing their own existence. The system behind them was even more formidable. with the ability to disappear people and suppress information with chilling efficiency. He needed help. Reliable, untraceable help. He reached out to a handful of men he trusted. Men who operated in the gray zones of the borderlands where loyalty was bought, but once earned, was unwavering. Agent Rodriguez and Agent Chen, both seasoned Border Patrol agents, had served under Luis for years. They knew him, trusted his instincts, and harbored their own quiet doubts about the official El Corso narrative. They were cautious, professional, but ultimately they believed in him. Then there were Jake and Marcus, former Army Rangers like Luis, now operating as high-end contractors. Mercenaries, some would call them. They were loyal only to the mission and the money, but Luis had worked with them before. They were exceptionally skilled, methodical, and utterly ruthless when the situation demanded it. Their faces gave nothing away. Their actions spoke volumes. Under the shroud of a moonless night, the team approached the heavily guarded perimeter around the El Corso checkpoint. The zone was officially closed, patrolled by federal agents Luis knew were compromised or complicit. But Luis knew the desert, knew the old migrant trails, the overlooked game paths, the blind spots in the surveillance grid. He guided them through hidden arroyos and over rocky rises, moving like wraiths, their equipment muffled, their movements precise. The air was thick with tension, a palpable hum of danger. "Stay tight," Luis whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustle of their tactical gear. "Any contact, we go silent. No heroics." They bypassed the official checkpoints, navigating by compass and the subtle landmarks Luis had memorized years ago. After what felt like an eternity of tense movement, they detected the faint metallic scent of something decaying. A smell unlike anything natural. It pulled them deeper into a network of ancient, unstable canyons. Finally, they found it. Tucked away in a cavernous opening, hidden behind a deceptively narrow fissure in the rock face, was a vast underground den. The entrance was perfectly concealed, a natural anomaly that had been subtly enhanced. Luis felt a prickle of unease. This was no random cave. This was a deliberate lair. Inside, the atmosphere was chilling. The air was cold, damp, and smelled strongly of musk, decay, and something else. A coppery tang that spoke of violence. Scattered across the uneven rock floor were bones, too numerous to count. Not animal bones. These were human. And amidst them, fragments of uniforms, scraps of military-grade gear, shreds of ballistic vests. They belonged to various agencies. Border Patrol, Drug Enforcement Administration, State Police, even snippets of federal issue. Luis knelt, his flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive gloom, illuminating a femur. It was clean, stripped bare, but the ends were jagged, almost sheared. Not gnawed. Ripped. This was not for food, Luis murmured, his voice tight. This was a cleanup. He picked up a tattered identification card. The corner showed a faded logo for the Department of Homeland Security. They were eliminating witnesses. Jake, ever pragmatic, grimaced, efficient. Marcus, less stoic, swallowed hard. Not human. No animal leaves bones like this. As they ventured deeper, the cavern expanded into a labyrinth of interconnected tunnels. Then Luis spotted them. Small, barely perceptible lenses glinting from crevices in the rock. Hidden cameras, expertly camouflaged. They were directed at the entrance, at various points within the cave, and even at the grisly piles of bones. Someone was watching. Someone was studying this place. Its inhabitants. Its victims. "They're observing," Luis said. pointing to one of the cameras. Not just hiding them, analyzing their behavior, their hunting patterns, and the effectiveness of their cleanups. A sudden, unsettling stillness descended upon the cavern. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. Luis felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. Rodriguez and Chen stiffened, their weapons raised, their eyes scanning the darkness. Even Jake and Marcus, usually unflappable, held their breath. "You feel that?" Chen whispered, his voice hoarse. It was not just the cold air or the unsettling silence. It was the feeling of being watched, not by a camera, but by something breathing, something alive. The shadows around them lengthened, moved just a fraction faster than they should, twisting into fleeting, monstrous shapes. The hair on Luis's arms stood on end. He had thought they were hunters, entering a den. But now, with chilling certainty, he knew. They were not just finding a lair. They had walked right into a trap. They were the bait. The order to collect samples and withdraw had barely left Luis's lips when the world erupted. It was not a single attack, but a coordinated, lightning-fast assault from multiple directions. One moment they were scanning the cavern's oppressive gloom. The next, shadows detached themselves from the deeper recesses, moving with impossible speed. "Contact!" Agent Rodriguez yelled, his voice strained as a blur of motion launched itself from the ceiling directly at Jake. The creatures were not merely rushing them. They moved with a chilling tactical precision. They did not charge head-on, exposing themselves to the team's concentrated fire. Instead, they used the cavern's jagged rock formations, the deep crevices, and the oppressive darkness to their advantage. They flowed through the shadows, appearing and disappearing, flanking, maneuvering, hunting with an intelligence that defied their bestial form. This was a coordinated ambush, executed by creatures that understood terrain and tactics. Jake, a veteran of countless close-quarters battles, spun, his rifle raising, but he was too slow. A silhouette with unnaturally elongated limbs exploded from behind a massive stalagmite faster than the eye could follow. It did not roar. It moved with a silent, terrible grace. One long, powerful hand clamped over Jake's face. There was a sickening, wet tearing sound. Jake did not even have time to scream. The creature ripped his face clean off, leaving behind a pulpy, bloody mask. Jake's body, convulsing violently, crumpled to the ground, his rifle clattering against the rock, as Luis desperately tried to bring his own weapon to bear. "Jake's down!" Marcus screamed, spraying suppressive fire into the darkness, his voice raw with a sudden, unbridled terror. He swung his rifle, firing wildly, trying to create space. But the creatures were too fast, too agile. Two of them, indistinct blurs in the periphery of Luis's vision, converged on Marcus simultaneously. Marcus let out a guttural cry of agony. Luis saw one of the creatures clamp its impossibly strong hand around Marcus's throat, twisting with brutal force. Marcus's desperate attempts to fire his weapon ceased. His scream quickly devolved into a wet, bubbling gasp as his windpipe was crushed, his throat visibly tearing. He sagged, a puppet with severed strings, his body dropping into the shadowy maw of the cavern floor. "Fall back! Fall back!" Luis roared, his voice hoarse, the metallic tang of blood filling his nostrils. His training kicked in, overriding the shock and horror. He grabbed Rodriguez by the shoulder, shoving him towards a narrow fissure they had scouted earlier. Chen was already moving, covering their rear, his own face pale, eyes wide with horror. They emptied magazines into the shifting shadows, the roar of their assault rifles deafening in the enclosed space. The muzzle flashes briefly illuminated the terrifying, fleeting shapes of their attackers. Lean, powerful figures, their eyes reflecting the light with that chilling, predatory glow. They were not just fighting for their lives. They were fighting to escape a slaughter. Luis, Rodriguez, and Chen, miraculously still on their feet, scrambled into the narrow crevice. The space was tight, forcing them to turn sideways. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them, the soft, padding thud of impossible feet, punctuated by guttural growls that were almost, but not quite, human. They were not just being pursued. They were being stalked, herded. The creatures were playing with them, enjoying the hunt. The air in the cavern was thick with the stench of gunpowder, human fear, and something else. Something rank and animalistic, an odor that spoke of primordial violence. Luis's team, men who had faced down cartel, hit squads and armed smugglers without flinching, were now consumed by pure, unadulterated terror. This was not a firefight. This was not a tactical engagement. This was a massacre. And they were simply the next on the menu. The narrow, winding crevice offered a temporary reprieve. Luis, Agent Rodriguez, and Agent Chen squeezed themselves into its tight confines, their bodies pressed against the damp, cold rock. The sounds of the creature's pursuit, the soft, padding thuds and guttural growls, slowly faded, swallowed by the cavern's oppressive silence. But the tension remained, a palpable, suffocating weight. Every shadow shifted. Every drip of water echoed like a footfall. "Are we clear?" Rodriguez whispered, his breath ragged, his eyes darting frantically into the darkness. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with sweat and grime, the remnants of terror still clinging to his features. Luis, his own heart still hammering against his ribs, listened intently. The silence that answered was deeper, more profound than before. It was the silence of emptiness and the silence of cunning. "For now," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "They are either waiting for us, or they lost the trail." He knew grimly that the former was more likely. These creatures were too intelligent for a simple chase. As Luis scanned the furthest reaches of their cramped refuge with his tactical light, the beam caught on something huddled in a dark corner. It was a person, curled into a fetal position, barely distinguishable from the rock. "Hold," Luis whispered to his agents, moving cautiously forward. He nudged the figure gently with his boot. It flinched, a low moan escaping its lips. It was a young man, a migrant, emaciated and covered in dust, his clothes ragged. His eyes, when they fluttered open, were wide with a terror that dwarfed even theirs. He was on the verge of unconsciousness, but alive. "Agente?" the migrant whispered, his voice weak. They broke them. Some of them." Luis knelt, recognizing the man from the recent intelligence reports, part of a group of undocumented migrants who had been processed through a new, unofficial border-crossing route, shrouded in secrecy. Certain groups had been funneled through by unknown actors. "Who broke them?" Luis asked, his voice low and urgent. "What happened?" The migrant struggled to speak, his words coming out in painful, disjointed gasps. "The others, they took us, promised passage. Then the changes began. Some changed, their bodies, stretching, muscles, tearing the clothes, their eyes, wild." He shuddered, a full-body tremor. "They screamed Agente, like their bones were breaking inside." Rodriguez and Chen exchanged horrified glances. The migrant's account was confirming Luis's worst fears, painting a detailed picture of the transformation. It was not a sickness, the migrant continued, his eyes unfocused, staring into the darkness. It was a training. They trained them to make the body take the form of a beast, strong, fast, like a hunter. He whispered the last words, and Luis felt goosebumps crawl up his arms. It was not a mutation. It was a controlled process, a horrifying, deliberate act. What about those who did not change? Chen asked, his voice barely audible. The migrant's gaze flickered, a fresh wave of terror washing over his face. They killed them. Those who resisted. Those who failed to accept the beast. They were taken away. No trace, no sound. Gone. Luis leaned back against the cold rock, the full, sickening truth settling upon him. This was not a natural phenomenon, not a rogue experiment. This was a sophisticated, government-backed project. It was deliberately creating and weaponizing these creatures, using vulnerable populations as raw material. Migrants, dispossessed, invisible to the system, were the perfect candidates, easily disappeared, easily forgotten. And the goal was not just to create super soldiers. It was to create tools of terror and control, to be unleashed and eliminated at will. The realization brought with it a profound sense of horror, far deeper than the fear of the monsters outside. The true monster was the chillingly logical, utterly dehumanizing system that orchestrated this. They were not just trying to cover up an incident. They were trying to erase the very existence of a monstrous, controlled experiment that turned people into weapons, and then purged any evidence of their suffering. Luis knew with grim certainty that he had stumbled upon something that transcended his wildest nightmares. It was a deliberate abomination, sanctioned and protected by forces he could barely comprehend. Luis knew his time was running out. The discovery of the migrant and his chilling testimony had cemented the terrifying reality of the project. He was dealing with a system, not a rogue group, and systems once provoked moved with devastating efficiency. He had to expose them, and he had to do it now. His satellite phone, a secure military-grade device, was his only link to the outside world. He pulled out his ruggedized laptop, its screen glowing faintly in the crevice's gloom. His fingers flew across the keyboard, a furious, desperate dance. He uploaded everything: the grainy, terrifying video footage from El Corso, the precise global positioning system coordinates of the hidden den, the audio recordings of Ricardo's testimony, even the migrants' whispered words about the training. He compressed the files, encrypted them with multiple layers of military-grade algorithms, and then, with a silent prayer, began to push them to an anonymous, secure cloud storage server he had set up months ago for contingencies. "What are you doing?" Agent Rodriguez whispered, watching him, his face a mask of exhaustion and fear. "Giving us a fighting chance," Luis replied, not looking up from the screen. When they went down, the truth would not go with them. He then opened a secure line to Samuel Thorne, a name whispered with reverence and dread in intelligence circles. Sam Thorne was a civilian, a relentless investigative journalist, specializing in military and intelligence exposés. He had a reputation for fearlessness and an uncanny ability to ferret out the truth. "Thorne," Luis said, his voice low, steady, despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "This is Ramirez. I have something big. Think black operations, Human experimentation, off-the-books assassinations. All federal. All off-grid. There was a pause on the other end, a crackle of static. Ramirez? I thought you went dark. This had to be worth it. Thorne's voice was raspy, accustomed to late nights and dangerous information. It's worth your life, Sam, Luis countered, his gaze fixed on the satellite signal strength. I'm sending you a link. Encrypted. Global positioning system coordinates for a meet point. You get the files, you go dark. You verify. You publish. Fast. He rattled off the rendezvous point, a secluded gas station far north of the border near a truck stop. It was nondescript, easy to blend in. Understood, Thorne said, a professional chill entering his voice. Sending a confirmation once files are received. Stay safe, Ramirez, and stay alive long enough for me to break this. The brief confirmation, a simple coded message indicating the files had begun downloading on Thorne's end, sent a fleeting spark of hope through Luis. This was it. Their single desperate chance to rip the curtain away, to expose the horrifying truth before the system could erase them completely. As dusk deepened and they cautiously began their slow, arduous climb out of the treacherous canyon, the desert painted in hues of deep purple and bruised orange, Luis paused. He felt it before he saw it, a prickling sensation on his skin, the subtle shift in the air. He turned slowly, scanning the distant, uneven horizon. There, on a ridge silhouetted against the last vestiges of twilight, stood a familiar figure. Lean, impossibly still. Lily. Her form was unmistakable, even from a quarter-mile away. She was not carrying a weapon. She was simply standing there, watching them. As the last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon, her eyes caught the dying light, reflecting it back with that same eerie, predatory glow Luis had seen in the office. It was a cold, calculating gleam, devoid of humanity. Then, as silently as she had appeared, she vanished, melting back into the deepening shadows of the desert. Luis felt a cold wave of dread wash over him, extinguishing the fleeting hope. This was not a coincidence. This was not random. They knew. They had known all along. This was a warning. A chilling personal message delivered by someone he had once known, someone he had once trusted. They were not just being hunted. They were being played. Adrenaline surged through Luis's veins, sharp and potent. The game had just shifted. He was no longer just an investigator. He was a target. His life, his mission, every breath he took, now revolved around one singular terrifying objective: deliver the truth before the monolithic system consumed him entirely. The clock had started, and he heard its relentless ticking in the vast, silent desert. The abandoned house stood like a skeletal sentinel amidst the sun-scorched desolation of the Texas desert, miles from any paved road. Its windows were vacant eyes staring out at nothing, its paint peeled by years of relentless sun and wind. Luis, Agent Rodriguez, and Agent Chen, battered, exhausted, and barely holding on to hope, chose it as their temporary refuge. It was a hollow shell, but it offered walls and a semblance of concealment. Inside, the dust lay thick on every surface, undisturbed for decades. The air was stale, hot, and heavy. As soon as they entered, an oppressive silence settled over them, broken only by their ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of their hearts. Every creak of the aging timbers, every whisper of the wind through broken window panes, made them flinch, their hands instinctively going to their weapons. Paranoia became their constant companion. Each shadow held a threat. Each glance out a grimy window was met with the vast, empty expanse of the desert, which suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like an open stage for their impending demise. They knew they were being pursued. They knew it was only a matter of time before they were found. The cold, calculating presence of Lily on the ridge still haunted Luis, a stark reminder of the enemy's reach. "We need a backup," Luis said, his voice raspy, breaking the silence. He pulled out a small, encrypted voice recorder from his tactical vest. When Thorn went dark, when the files were purged, this was it. He began to speak, his voice low and steady despite the tremor in his hands. He recounted everything. The El Corso incident, Ben Carter's disappearance, Mateo's account of the goat massacre, Ricardo's terrifying revelation of the speaking creatures, Lily's transformation, the horrors of the cavern, the migrant's testimony. He detailed the project's structure, its ruthless cover-up, the systemic nature of the threat. It was a desperate, comprehensive attempt to immortalize the truth, a final act of defiance. Rodriguez and Chen listened in grim silence, their own despair reflected in their tired eyes. Midnight came, bringing with it a deceptive coolness. Luis had slumped against a decaying wall, trying to conserve energy, his mind racing through every escape route, every contingency. Rodriguez and Chen were huddled in corners, their rifles resting across their laps, their gazes fixed on the empty doorways, their faces etched with a profound weariness. Then it came, a low, persistent hum from the night sky. It was not the familiar thrum of a helicopter, nor the distant roar of a commercial jet. It was something lower, more mechanical, utterly silent until it was directly overhead. Luis pushed himself up, his eyes scanning the blackness above. Then he saw it, a tiny red dot, followed by another, then another, forming a triangular pattern in the vast expanse. It was a drone, not a consumer model, not even a standard military reconnaissance unit. This was something else. Its red lights pulsed rhythmically, like malevolent, predatory eyes, watching them, assessing them. A cold, precise dread filled Luis's chest, pushing out the last vestiges of hope. This was no ordinary pursuit. This was not even the werewolves he had faced in the cave. This was a sophisticated, high-tech hunt, executed by an invisible, omniscient enemy. Their adversary was not just monsters. It was a perfectly oiled, state-sanctioned machine, capable of pinpoint destruction. He looked at Rodriguez, then at Chen. In their eyes he saw the same grim understanding, the same dawning resignation that mirrored his own. They were brave men, skilled and resilient, but against this kind of power, the silent, unseen hand of a system that controlled both man and machine, both beast and advanced technology, they stood no chance. The air in the dilapidated house suddenly felt heavy, charged with an invisible, destructive force. They were trapped, isolated, and utterly exposed. The silence from the drone overhead was more terrifying than any scream. It was the sound of a system preparing to clean up its mess. The strike came without warning. There was no whistling descent of a bomb, no concussive roar of an explosion, not even the shattering of glass. Just a blinding, incandescent flash that consumed the abandoned house in a nanosecond of pure, searing light. It was not a conventional weapon. This was something designed for absolute eradication, for the complete and total vaporization of matter. The light was so intense it left no shadows, only a temporary void on the retina of any distant observer. In that singular, horrifying instant, the structure, the men within it, the dust on the floor, the very air itself, all ceased to exist. Everything was incinerated, atomized, leaving no trace. The flash was followed by an unnatural silence, the air utterly still, devoid of the expected aftershocks. When the light faded, there was nothing left but a perfectly smooth, circular patch of melted earth, still faintly glowing with residual heat. No debris, no shattered timbers, no bodies, no scorched remnants. The house, Luis, Rodriguez, Chen, all the evidence they carried, all had been reduced to nothingness. They had never been there at all. The next morning, tucked away in the back pages of regional Texas newspapers, was a brief, almost dismissive report. Gas leak causes explosion in remote area. In some syndicated versions, the report read, "Electrical transformer malfunction sparks blaze in unpopulated zone." The reports were short, vague, and stated as definitive fact. No injuries or casualties reported. The lie was perfectly fabricated, a seamless erasure of truth. Simultaneously, Luis's desperate gambit with the cloud storage proved futile. The moment the encrypted files began uploading, the system detected the intrusion. A silent, invisible protocol was triggered. Every byte of data Luis had managed to transmit, the videos, the global positioning system coordinates, the audio recordings, was meticulously identified, quarantined, and then irrevocably deleted from the server. Not just removed, but overwritten with gibberish, then purged from backup logs. The data had never existed. His entire digital footprint, along with that of his team, vanished from every government database, every public record. They became phantoms. Across the country, in a cluttered, unassuming office in Baltimore, investigative journalist Samuel Thorne received an unceremonious visit. His website, which had been preparing to host the explosive data, suddenly went dark, replaced by a generic server error message. His secure satellite phone, the very one Luis had called, abruptly disconnected and went dead. Within hours, his apartment building was surrounded by unmarked police vehicles. He was officially reported missing without a trace to his distraught family. The terse police statement offering no answers, no leads. His extensive research, his notes, his private hard drives, all disappeared from his apartment. It was not merely revenge. It was not simply a cleanup operation. This was part of a larger, systemic protocol designed for absolute information suppression. The project, whatever its true name, would tolerate no leaks, no witnesses, no inconvenient truths. Every vector for exposure was identified, targeted, and neutralized with cold, ruthless efficiency. No carrier of the truth was permitted to survive. The message was clear, chilling, and absolute. Some secrets would remain buried, no matter the cost, no matter how many lives stood in their way. The private office of Director Evelyn Hayes in the Washington headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation was a study in controlled power. The air was cool, meticulously conditioned, and carried the faint scent of polished wood and ionized air. Hayes herself, a woman in her late 40s, sat behind a sprawling mahogany desk. Her dark suit was tailored with exquisite precision, and her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a severe bun. Her gaze, however, was her most striking feature. Cold, analytical, and capable of penetrating facades with unnerving ease. On the secure terminal embedded in her desk, the digital dossier of Luis Ramirez was displayed. Hayes studied it, her expression unreadable. Photographs of Ramirez, From his early days as a fresh-faced Army Ranger to his more recent, hardened intelligence agent profile, scrolled across the screen. Beside them were detailed reports, commendations for exceptional service, but also recurring annotations highlighting his unconventional methods, his tendency towards independent investigations, and a note marked in red: difficulty adhering to strict procedural directives when personal convictions conflict. A liability, in short. Hayes's long, manicured fingers paused on a satellite image of the now vaporized house in the Texas desert. The melted patch of earth was stark against the surrounding scrubland. She then scrolled to the final entry in Ramirez's dossier. A brief, clinical summary of his established disloyalty and subsequent neutralization. Without a word, she reached for a heavy, antique brass stamp, its base engraved with a stark, red P. She pressed it firmly onto the digital icon of the dossier, and the screen flashed, replacing the image of Ramirez with a single crimson word: purged. It was more than a mark of completion. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of utter annihilation, a declaration that the individual and all records of their unauthorized existence or activities had been systematically erased from existence. Hayes then turned her attention to a framed photograph on her desk. It showed Lily Anderson. She stood among a small group of other individuals, all dressed in civilian clothes, all smiling subtly. To the untrained eye, they appeared perfectly ordinary. But Hayes's gaze honed in on their eyes. In Lily's eyes and in the eyes of the others, there was that subtle, unsettling luminescence, the unnatural reflection of light that Luis Ramirez had found so disturbing. Lily's smile was flawless, a perfect curve of lips, but it held no warmth, no genuine emotion, only a cold, unsettling perfection. These were the successes, the assets, the proof that Project Raptor, as it was internally designated, was not only viable, but thriving. Hayes felt a surge of professional satisfaction. The project had refined its transformation process, creating more stable and controllable subjects. These individuals, outwardly indistinguishable from any other citizen, could be seamlessly integrated into society, deployed for reconnaissance, infiltration, and, when absolutely necessary, liquidation. Their inhuman nature, their enhanced capabilities, were merely tools, carefully honed and deployed. As if on cue, the screen on her desk flickered, displaying a live feed from a high-altitude surveillance drone. The image showed a group of migrants, their figures indistinct in the pre-dawn light, slowly crossing a remote stretch of the Texas border. They moved furtively, burdened by their meager possessions. Then, a new silhouette appeared among them, moving with an unnatural fluidity. Its limbs were just a fraction too long, its movements too precise. It was a recent candidate, recently released. On the screen, a small data overlay flashed. Subject designation: Raptor 7. Clearance approved. Access level: black. The project was not merely continuing, it was expanding. New assets were being deployed, integrated into the very fabric of society, their true nature hidden behind masks of normalcy. The desert border, once a symbol of division, was now a gateway for a terrifying, insidious new force. And the truth, obliterated along with Luis Ramirez and his team, remained buried, replaced by a meticulously constructed silence. No one would ever know. Luis Ramirez, even in his final moments, understood the true nature of the horror he faced. His frantic voice recordings, now annihilated from existence, detailed his grim conclusions. These were not mythological shapeshifters. They were the terrifying progeny of scientific hubris, the apex of genetic modification and engineered viral mutation, transforming human beings into living weapons. The werewolves were not beasts of legend, but products of a lab, carefully crafted instruments of terror. He had deduced the project's true objective. It was not about creating super soldiers for a conventional war. It was far more insidious. These altered humans were designed as tools for manipulation, for the silent elimination of undesirables, and chillingly, for the control of vulnerable populations like migrants. They were shields and, in some cases, blades, wielded by a faceless power. The border itself became a proving ground, a means to filter and capture the perfect test subjects, desperate, voiceless individuals who would vanish without question. The cold, calculating logic of the clandestine intelligence agencies was brutally apparent in every aspect of the project. The methodical selection of victims for transformation, undocumented migrants, military prisoners of war, the homeless, all those invisible to the system, showcased a profound dehumanization. They were not seen as people, but as resources and as obstacles to be eradicated. And the total meticulous destruction of any trace, any witness, any information, reinforced this inhumanity. The system did not merely cover its tracks, it vaporized them. Throughout his investigation, Luis had battled not against a localized threat, but against an omnipresent, invincible enemy. The true terror was not that the monsters existed, but that they were systemic. This was not a band of rogue villains operating in the shadows. This was a powerful, sprawling bureaucratic apparatus, leveraging unimaginable resources, utilizing cutting-edge technology, and wielding its monstrous creations with impunity. It was a hydra, cutting off one head only for two more to grow. The profound tragedy of Luis's journey, and the story itself, transcended the visceral horror of the transformed humans. The true moral lesson was that the monsters were merely instruments, extensions of human will, controlled and deployed for chillingly utilitarian goals. It laid bare the unsettling truth of humanity's capacity for cruelty when power and perceived necessity blurred the lines of morality. The project explored, and then gleefully obliterated, the boundaries of human ethics. The grim, unyielding conclusion was not merely a narrative choice. It was a stark warning. When the system itself controlled such abominations, when it silenced every voice that dared to speak the truth, when it could erase individuals and their knowledge as if they had never existed, then darkness prevailed. The monstrous creations continued their silent operations, integrated into society, carrying out their sinister directives, and the world remained blissfully, lethally unaware. The nightmare, born in the desert, continued its silent, terrifying expansion, cloaked in layers of official denials and digital silence. The aftermath of El Corso was a masterclass in bureaucratic suppression. The desert wind, once a witness, now only carried whispers of dust. Anyone who dared to speak of the incident, of the mangled sport utility vehicle, the strange silence, or the vanishing officers, found themselves subtly but firmly discouraged. Local sheriffs received advisory visits from humorless federal agents who spoke of national security interests and hinted at career-ending consequences for loose lips. Their authority, once absolute in their dusty counties, withered under the implicit threat. Luis's former colleagues, who had seen the subtle shift in Ben Carter's demeanor before his disappearance, found themselves second-guessing their own memories. Had Carter truly seemed off? Had the incident really been that strange? The official narrative, repeated endlessly by media and internal memos, began to take root. A tragic accident, a misunderstanding, nothing to see here. Doubt became a potent weapon, driving wedges between memories and reality. Physical evidence, once meticulously logged in local police departments, began to disappear. Reports of the missing Ford expedition, of the strange bloodstains, were marked as misfiled or lost in the labyrinthine archives. Case numbers for missing persons, migrants, border crossers, even a few local drifters who vanished near the area, were quietly closed, marked runaway or unidentifiable. A complete informational vacuum was engineered, a perfect zero state where the incident at El Corso and all its horrifying implications simply ceased to exist. Maria Rodriguez, the patrol officer who had stood beside Ben Carter that night, bore the brunt of the psychological suppression. She tried to tell her story, recounting the mangled vehicle, the impossible shadow, the chilling efficiency of the Federal Bureau of Investigation cleanup. Her pleas were met with sympathetic nods, then concerned glances. Within weeks, she was officially declared suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, her experiences conveniently categorized as symptoms of trauma. She was placed on mandatory psychological rehabilitation leave, a gilded cage designed to silence her and erode her credibility. Her words, once direct eyewitness accounts, became the ravings of a broken mind. Every mention of Luis Ramirez in electronic databases was swiftly and expertly modified or purged. His years of distinguished service records were condensed, his investigative successes scrubbed clean. What remained were dry, truncated entries. Agent Ramirez, Luis. Service end date, date of disappearance. Reason? Personal resignation. He became a ghost in the machine, a statistic in a forgotten ledger. The man who had once been a sharp, inconvenient asset was now a non-person. The federal agents, those faceless figures who had descended upon El Corso, were rewarded. Promotions, transfers to prestigious, highly classified departments. Their faces remained unknown, their names unlinked to the atrocity they had helped orchestrate. They were merely cogs in the larger machine, executing their grim directives without question, their loyalties absolute, their consciences unmoved. And the victims, the unfortunate migrants who became unwilling subjects, the soldiers and border officers who stumbled upon the truth and were brutally silenced. Their names were never spoken. They became statistics, forgotten numbers in a dark, secret project that continued to expand, metastasizing silently in the shadows of the nation's periphery. Their sacrifices went unacknowledged, their existence utterly erased by the very system designed to protect them. The silence was deafening, a monument to a truth too terrible to ever see the light of day. The mahogany table in the secure Washington conference room gleamed under the recessed lighting, reflecting the grim, unsmiling faces of the senior officials gathered. Evelyn Hayes, now the director of the Special Operations Division, occupied the head of the table, her composure as unyielding as ever. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept across the room. "Gentlemen, ladies," she began, her voice crisp and authoritative, "we are here to review the progress of Project Raptor." A series of holographic projections shimmered into existence above the table. Images of the desert, of various biometric scans, of complex genetic sequences, rotated slowly. A deep, reassuring voiceover began to detail the successes. Phase 2 of Project Raptor is proceeding ahead of schedule. The asset integration protocols have been refined, achieving an 87% stability rate in modified subjects. We've successfully minimized physiological anomalies, allowing for seamless deep cover insertion. The scope of the project had expanded far beyond the initial border experiments. The new candidates for transformation were no longer limited to vulnerable migrants. Data slides showed demographic breakdowns, prisoners of war from undisclosed conflicts, individuals from marginalized sectors of society, the homeless, the severely indebted, those with no families, no ties, no one to ask questions. The process of selection and transformation had become ruthlessly efficient, less risky, more controlled. We have achieved significant breakthroughs in neural conditioning, the voiceover continued, as a composite image of Lily Anderson materialized above the table. She looked poised, elegant, her eyes reflecting the projection's light with that familiar unnerving glow. Subject Lily Anderson, prototype Alpha 1, represents our ideal. Fully controllable, fully integrated into her former operational environment. Capable of both enhanced surveillance and rapid liquidation without visible physiological anomalies. Hayes nodded, a subtle gesture of approval. Lily, the partner Luis Ramirez had known, was now a chilling testament to the project's perfection. She was the ghost that walked among them, an agent of terrifying efficiency. New border corridors were being opened, not just in Arizona, but now extending deep into the vast, desolate stretches of South Texas. The arid landscape, once a mere crossing point, had become a sprawling, secluded proving ground. Surveillance cameras, like silent, unblinking eyes, were positioned to record every phase of tactical deployment, every training exercise, every successful integration. The desert was their canvas, and human lives were their paint. Furthermore, the voiceover announced, the tone betraying a hint of pride, "Our development of alpha specimens is nearing completion." These subjects exhibit even greater physical strength and cognitive abilities, including advanced tactical problem-solving and demonstrated leadership potential. They represent the apex of the Project Raptor evolution. Images flashed, silhouettes impossibly fast, faces with eyes that burned with a chilling intelligence, their movements precise and utterly lethal. These were the true monsters Luis had envisioned, but now they were refined, perfected, ready to be unleashed. The meeting concluded with a round of quiet, professional applause. The success of Project Raptor was undeniable. The implications, however, were terrifying. A secret army of human-derived predators integrated into society, controlled by an unseen hand, ready to act on a silent command. And with every truth-teller erased, with every digital footprint scrubbed clean, the world remained ignorant, blissfully unaware of the horror evolving in its shadows. The nightmare, far from ending, was just beginning its insidious, quiet expansion.